She jiggled the door handle of the Rolls-Royce. The key fob was dead. She sighed, flipped out the tiny metallic key, and slipped it into the lock. A siren wailed. Then a voice behind her barked, "Step away from the vehicle, ma'am." Before she could even turn around, 2 officers rushed her. Rough hands grabbed her wrists. Metal clinked behind her back. A crowd had started forming across the parking lot. Someone pulled out their phone. Another whispered, "Caught red-handed trying to steal a Rolls. What a shame." She looked nothing like the car's owner, they assumed. Just a simple woman. No designer purse. No flashy jewelry. No entitled attitude. Just wide, confused eyes behind cheap glasses, and a soft voice that barely got out, "But it's mine." They didn't believe her. They never even asked. The cold snap of metal cuffs bit into her wrists as she was pushed toward the patrol car, her face flushed not from guilt, but from confusion and shame. Her breath fogged in the morning air as she tried to speak, tried to explain, but her voice kept catching in her throat. "It's mine," she said again quietly, almost to herself now. No one listened. One of the officers radioed something about attempted grand theft auto, while the other rummaged through her bag like she was already convicted. She watched as they tossed aside her reusable grocery bag, spilling out bananas, a loaf of whole wheat bread, and a dented can of soup she had bought on clearance. The way they looked at her, it wasn't just suspicion, it was certainty. To them, she fit the image of a thief far better than she ever could the owner of a Rolls-Royce. Her faded coat had lint on the sleeves, and her sneakers were scuffed at the toe. The key fob had died, and when she'd tried to use the hidden manual key, she had looked too much like someone breaking in. No one asked for paperwork. No one checked the plates. The car was locked. The woman was plain, and their minds were made up. She was shoved into the back of the cruiser, knees knocking together, heart pounding like a trapped bird in her chest. She turned her head to look back through the rear window at her car. The car she had driven for 3 years. The one she kept clean with her own hands. The one she never boasted about. Just sitting there in the lot like a silent witness. They didn't even let her lock it. At the station, her belongings were taken. She gave her name, twice, and each time the officer behind the desk squinted like he didn't believe her. "Driver's license?" he asked. "It's in my bag," she said, but her bag had been left behind. Or maybe it was in one of those plastic bins she saw being wheeled away. No one told her anything. They fingerprinted her, took her mugshot, and led her past a hallway of closed doors to a holding cell that smelled of bleach and despair. She sat down on the hard bench, her hands trembling in her lap, trying to will herself not to cry. A woman across the cell snorted, "What'd you do, church lady? Run out with a flat screen from Walmart?" She didn't answer. Her mind drifted to the little things. Her tea kettle left on the counter, her cat probably meowing at the door, her husband who must have been wondering where she was. She tried to ask for a phone call, but the officer just waved her off. Later, he said. That later never came. Instead, time stretched, like taffy, slow, sticky, unbearable. She watched the clock tick past each hour like a punishment. Her mouth was dry, her stomach empty, and the cold from the concrete seeped into her bones. Sometime around midnight, a young officer came to check the cells. He didn't say much, just did his rounds, but when he got to her, he paused. "You all right, ma'am?" he asked, voice lower than the others. She looked up, startled. His eyes were soft. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. He opened his mouth like he might say more, but then another officer called his name from the hallway, and he turned away too quickly, like even that moment of gentleness might get him in trouble. She leaned back against the wall and closed her eyes. In the darkness behind her lids, memories came rushing in like a flood, clipping coupons at the kitchen table, wearing the same winter coat year after year because there's still life in it, letting others talk over her in meetings because keeping peace was more important than being heard. She had always lived simply, not out of necessity, but by choice. She didn't need to show off, didn't need to prove anything. But now she wished she had worn the gold watch her husband bought her for their anniversary. Now she wished she'd carried the designer handbag she kept in the closet. untouched, because it felt too much. Maybe then they would have believed her. In a burst of desperation, she asked again for a phone call. This time, she was led to a corner phone and handed the receiver like a crumb of dignity. She dialed her husband's number by heart. It rang twice, then again, and then, "Hello?" His voice. Her breath caught. "They arrested me," she whispered. "They thought I was stealing the car." Silence. Then his voice, firm and steady. "Where are you?" But before she could finish giving the address, the officer snatched the phone from her hands. "Time's up," he said, hanging it up with a final click that sounded like a door slamming shut. She didn't even know if the call had gone through. The humiliation sat heavy in her gut. Her husband, her anchor, didn't even have the full address. She was back in the cell within minutes, heart hollow with uncertainty. The woman across from her snorted again. "Guess money don't get you nowhere in here, huh?" she sneered. Still, she didn't respond. What was the point? To shout, "I didn't do it," into the void? To tell strangers that the car was hers, the life was hers, and that she had done absolutely nothing wrong? She stared down at her hands, nails short and unpolished, palms dry. There was no one left to convince. Hours passed. She didn't sleep. Not really. She dozed in fragments, startled awake each time someone walked by. In the quietest parts of the night, the only sounds were distant murmurs and the buzzing light above her. She folded her arms over herself and rocked gently, trying to stay warm. Somewhere in the distance, a television was playing. The evening news. A story caught her ear. Woman caught attempting to steal luxury car in broad daylight. Her name, her face. Grainy footage from someone's phone showed her fumbling with the lock, eyes darting around nervously as the officers arrived. She looked guilty. Even she thought so, looking at it through their lens. "Unbelievable," someone muttered. Laughter echoed down the hallway. The world outside was making up its mind before the truth had a chance to breathe. Her face had gone viral, but not as herself. Not as a woman, a wife, a human being. As a meme, a cautionary tale, a thief. In the dead silence that followed, she wrapped her arms tighter around herself and thought about the quiet way she lived. The way she never corrected the barista who misspelled her name. The way she always let others go first at the grocery store. How many times had she shrunk herself so others could feel comfortable? How many times had she downplayed everything, her wealth, her happiness, even her pain? It was easier that way. People liked you more when you weren't too much. But tonight, in a cell that smelled like bleach and despair, she felt the weight of every time she'd let someone underestimate her. Not just let them, but help them do it. And now here she was, alone, criminalized, erased. Somewhere around 4 a.m, she stopped trying to stay awake. Her body slumped against the wall, exhaustion swallowing her whole. As she drifted into a restless sleep, the last thought in her mind wasn't fear or anger or even confusion. It was her husband's voice on the phone, the sharp inhale when she'd told him what happened, the pause, the quiet fury she knew was there behind his silence. Wherever he was now, he would find her. She clung to that as her only comfort, unaware that her husband, once dismissed as a background figure in her life, was about to walk through the front doors of that police station with the kind of authority that silences rooms. But for now, she was just a woman in a cell, misjudged, misnamed, forgotten. The sun had barely begun to rise when the first SUV pulled into the lot, its matte black paint gleaming under the cold morning light. Within seconds, 4 more followed, forming a silent procession of power, each vehicle identical in make and model, their windows tinted dark enough to reflect the confused faces of the early shift officers, stepping out for their morning coffee. The engines cut off one by one, and for a moment, the only sound in the parking lot was the hum of fluorescent lights from the building, and the distant caw of a crow perched on a lamppost. Then, the first door opened. A polished leather shoe touched the ground. Out stepped a man in a charcoal gray suit, his tie sharp, his shoulders squared. He moved like someone who didn't need to announce who he was. The air bent around his presence. His name wasn't known to the front desk officer who glanced up when he walked in, but it would be. He was flanked by 2 lawyers, one carrying a manila folder thick with documents, the other already on a call with someone higher up. Behind them came two men from security, and trailing slightly behind, a composed woman holding a tablet, her eyes scanning the building like she was preparing a press briefing. They didn't speak when they entered. They didn't need to. Their arrival said everything. At the front desk, the officer choked on his coffee. "Can I help you?" he stammered. The man in the gray suit set his gaze on him, calm and unreadable. "My wife was arrested here yesterday," he said, his voice even deliberate. "Her name is Evelyn Monroe. I want her released immediately." The officer blinked. The name wasn't familiar, not because it wasn't written down, but because no one had bothered to care who she really was. He began tapping keys frantically, pulling up the records. "Yes, 1 second." But before he could finish, the taller of the two lawyers stepped forward. "We'd like access to the booking report, surveillance footage, and the names of every officer involved in her detainment." His tone wasn't aggressive, but it didn't invite negotiation. The woman with the tablet added, "This matter is already under public scrutiny. I suggest you act quickly." Something in her voice hinted that she had emails scheduled, articles queued, and interviews waiting on hold. Word traveled fast inside the building. Within 5 minutes, the officers who had arrested Evelyn the day before stood in the hallway outside the sergeant's office, eyes darting nervously between the door and each other. The younger one muttered, "We thought she was breaking into the car," but even he didn't sound sure anymore. The older one, the one who had dismissed her pleas, who had hung up on her phone call, kept silent, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might crack. Inside the security room, the footage was being replayed. Evelyn, standing alone beside her Rolls-Royce, key fob in one hand, manual key in the other, her shoulders hunched, movements unsure, clearly more frustrated than sneaky. Then the moment the cruisers pull up, the arrest, the cuffs, her lips moving in protest. "It's mine. It's mine." Someone turned down the volume, but the silence in the room grew louder. Behind the glass, the man in the suit watched with unblinking eyes, arms folded. When the clip ended, he turned to the chief, who had just arrived in a flurry of buttons and clipped apologies. "I don't want excuses," he said. "I want accountability, and I want my wife." The chief nodded quickly, sweat already forming on his temples. "Of course, sir. Right away." Downstairs, the holding cell door creaked open. Evelyn sat curled against the wall, her eyes swollen from a night without rest. When she looked up, she didn't recognize the officer at first. He wore the same uniform, but not the same demeanor. "Mrs. Monroe," he said softly, "your husband's here." The words hit her like a gust of warm air after a night in the cold. She rose slowly, every muscle stiff, but her posture straightened the moment she stepped out. As she was led down the hallway, every officer she passed stepped aside. Some nodded, others looked away. The hallway was longer than she remembered, quieter. At the end stood her husband. No anger in his face, no drama, just steady eyes and an outstretched hand holding the coat she'd left behind. He draped it over her shoulders like a knight would armor his queen. She clutched it close. It smelled like home, like safety, like love. He didn't ask her if she was okay. He already knew she wasn't. He didn't say, "I told you I'd come," because of course he would. He simply placed his hand on the small of her back and turned with her toward the exit. Outside, the air had shifted. Where yesterday there were whispers of mockery, today there was tension. Several officers stood holding the door open, their eyes lowered. Behind the SUVs, a small group of reporters had already gathered, alerted by whispers on social media that something big was happening at the station. Cameras were already rolling. As Evelyn stepped into the sunlight, still in the drab station-issued jumpsuit, her husband walked beside her like she was wearing a crown. Flashbulbs popped. Reporters shouted questions. "Mrs. Monroe, were you wrongfully arrested? Is it true they thought you were stealing your own car?" But no one answered. Her husband nodded once at the press liaison, and she stepped forward, calmly stating, "There will be a statement later today. Right now, Mr. and Mrs. Monroe will not be taking questions." That clip, just 6 seconds long, would later trend on social media under the caption, "She walked out like a queen," and they bowed their heads. The same video of her arrest from the night before, now played side by side with this new one, and people couldn't reconcile the two versions of the same woman. The thief, the billionaire's wife, the prisoner, the powerhouse. As the couple approached the SUV, her husband opened the door for her himself. She paused just before getting in and turned to look back at the building. One of the arresting officers stood by the doorway, his arms crossed tightly, face stiff. Their eyes met. He didn't apologize. He didn't even flinch. But his expression had changed. Not with guilt, but with shame. She didn't say a word. She just looked at him, long enough for him to feel it. Then she got into the car. Inside, the world felt quieter. Her husband reached over and took her hand. She didn't cry. She didn't collapse. She just breathed. Finally, deeply. As the convoy pulled away from the station, the 5 black SUVs moved like shadows swallowing the pavement. A silent declaration that the world had misjudged her, and that this misjudgment would not go unanswered. Inside one of the trailing cars, her legal counsel had already begun drafting a formal complaint. The media representative was reviewing public statements. Her husband's security chief was vetting every officer's badge number and pulling internal records. There would be consequences. There would be accountability. But none of that mattered more than the simple truth that had been ignored from the start. She was innocent. She always had been. And now the world would have to reckon with the cost of not listening. The morning after she left the police station, Evelyn stood in her backyard, kneeling quietly in the flower bed by the fence, hands buried in soil. The world beyond her white picket fence was ablaze, headlines screaming her name, social media whirling with outrage and apologies, hashtags trending in her honor. But none of that reached her here. Her garden, as always, was her retreat. She didn't need to read the thousands of messages pouring into her inbox. She didn't care about the half-hearted apologies from influencers who had rushed to mock her the day before. They had seen a woman in simple clothes fumbling with a luxury car and assumed the worst. And now, scrambling to save face, they were rewriting their narratives, changing captions, deleting tweets, editing thumbnails. One account had posted, "Turns out the lady stealing the rolls owns 5 of them and lives in a mansion." Oops. Another, "Never judge a book by its cover. Major respect to Evelyn Monroe for staying classy." But Evelyn wasn't reading any of it. She had already spent a lifetime being misunderstood. She didn't need their redemption. Her fingers gently patted down the soil around a young marigold, her nails still stained from the night before, her wedding ring glinting in the morning sun like a quiet reminder of who she really was. Inside the house, her husband was pacing through calls. Legal teams were finalizing reports. Their publicist had already drafted a statement, though Evelyn had insisted it be short, clear, and firm. "Yes, I was arrested. No, I was not stealing. Yes, it was my car. I am home now. That is all." News outlets that had rushed to label her a suspect were now tripping over themselves to repair the damage. Interviews were requested, op-eds were pitched, and think pieces began flooding the web about unconscious bias, profiling, and the hidden cost of assumptions. Talk show hosts invited her to speak. Publishers reached out with book deals. Even fashion magazines wanted a piece of her now, offering stylists, cover shoots, features. But Evelyn declined all of them. She didn't want revenge. She didn't want fame. What she wanted was peace, and to prune her roses before the sun got too high. The truth had shattered through the internet like a thunderclap. Not only was she the legal owner of the Rolls-Royce, but the vehicle was registered under her name exclusively. The pink slip, the insurance, the garage tag, all hers. Someone leaked a clip of the dealership delivery video from years ago, where she and her husband had picked it up together. She was wearing jeans and a hoodie, smiling shyly, while the salesman handed her the key, unaware he was being recorded. That clip now made its rounds online too, juxtaposed against the one where officers had pinned her against the car she'd once posed beside with joy. One showed ownership, the other erasure. People were beginning to understand the difference. What most didn't know, however, was that Evelyn had never asked for wealth. When she met her husband, he was still drowning in student loans, delivering food by night and coding by day. She believed in him long before anyone else did. She helped pay rent when his first startup crashed. She sold her mother's necklace to help fund his second. She worked 2 jobs while he built apps that no one downloaded, until one did, and then everything changed. Their lives took off like a rocket ship, and suddenly they had more than they'd ever dreamed of. But Evelyn stayed the same. She still shopped in quiet markets, still brought baked goods to neighbors, still wore her favorite coat from the clearance rack, the one with the missing button she always meant to sew. She never wanted the world to look at her differently. But now, because of one dead key fob, they had. In a quiet gesture of appreciation, her husband arranged for the one person at the station who had treated her like a human being, the young officer who asked if she was okay, to be transferred to a better post. The promotion had been subtle, with no press or announcement, just a call to someone who owed a favor, and a quiet signature on a form. That young man, now working in a city precinct with better pay and better leadership, would never know exactly who had pulled the strings, but maybe one day he would. And he'd remember that sometimes kindness isn't just good, it's noticed. As for the officers who had thrown her in the cell, they faced internal review. The older one, the one who ripped the phone from her hands, was put on indefinite suspension. The younger one, rattled and silent during the fallout, was reassigned to desk duty while the department reviewed their procedures. The chief issued a public apology, flat, rehearsed, and likely written by someone else. But Evelyn didn't care. It wasn't for her. It was for the cameras. She had no interest in their remorse. What she wanted was something far rarer: change. The dealership where it all began sent her a handwritten letter of apology and offered a lifetime of free service, oil changes, and detailing. They didn't say much, but the envelope included a small box containing the same model of the key fob, this time with a fresh battery. Evelyn opened it once, looked at it, then placed it gently in a drawer beside her measuring spoons. Let the world scramble around trying to fix what they broke. She was already moving on. It wasn't until the following weekend, at a local charity event for girls in foster care, that Evelyn found herself face to face with someone who didn't want an interview, a soundbite, or a story. Just a moment. A girl, no older than 10, stood in front of her, holding a paper cup of lemonade. Her eyes were wide, curious. "Miss Monroe?" she asked. Evelyn knelt beside her. "Yes, sweetheart?" The girl's voice was soft but sure. "Why didn't you tell them who you were? Like, in the beginning? If you had, they would have stopped, right?" For a second, Evelyn looked into those young eyes and saw the world still unscarred by judgment. Then she smiled, brushing a leaf off the girl's shoulder. "Because I shouldn't have to," she said. And in that moment, no cameras flashed, no tweets were posted, and no news anchors shouted her name. But that girl nodded, like something inside her shifted, and Evelyn knew that moment mattered more than all the rest.